So we are trying to figure out what would be the best way of creating a set of rules to make sure that we mobilize people and they understand who will be mobilized, when, and the most important, for how long. And of course, to motivate people to go to the front, there are many ways, but one of the main threats and main counter arguments that they have is this fear of fighting the enemy empty-handed. And this is why the news about the delays with the ammunition and with the weapons, with the support package stuck in the US Congress, it honestly does not really help at all. And not only on the factual side, but also on the motivational side.
Almost 2 years ago, this happened to Ukraine. Sirens sounded as Russian troops crossed the border to start the offence that many had feared, but few believed would actually happen. 2 years on, and the situation seems no closer to a resolution. The West's staunch backing of Ukraine seems at risk, with the US foreign aid budget being stuck in limbo in Congress, and little headway has been made on either side this year on the ground in Ukraine itself. So will 2024 be the year that we see an end to the conflict? And just how important is the West's support? Well, I'm joined now by Anthony Lloyd, the Times war correspondent, and by Kira Rudik, the leader of the Holos Party in the Ukrainian parliament. And in just a few moments, we'll speak to Lee Turner, former UK ambassador to Kyiv. Anthony, just before we get to how Ukrainians are surviving 2 years in, what's your assessment of where the war is at the moment?
Ukraine's in a more perilous state than it was a year ago. It's facing a number of key challenges, both external challenges and internal. Primarily, the external challenges involve the funding and equipping, not just by the US, but very much by Europe too. And unless it can keep its allies staunch, it will be overwhelmed by Russia. Internally, it has to sort out its issue of mobilization. At the moment, it cannot rotate its key units from the front lines. You've got a lot of exhaustion amongst units who are kept on the front line without rotation, while Russia, conversely, has managed to recruit 300,000 volunteers to its forces over the last year, sorted out its problems with force generation, is rebudgeted and re-equipped in an advantageous way. So Ukraine's got some real difficulties in the year ahead.
Well, you had a piece this week talking about Ukraine being able to win, but it would need a bigger army to do so. And I just want you to contextualise that, because so much of what we've been hearing in this country is about, technological strikes or the use of drones to sink ships, or we've heard more about kit than we have about personnel. But in any war, boots on the ground matters, doesn't it?
Yeah, first of all, the piece I wrote said that very much at the moment, the advantage is with the Russians in the war, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. Now, that doesn't mean a fulcrum point has been crossed. There's a point of no return. Ukraine could still win, but there are a lot of ifs along the way there. So to answer your question, this war is about territory. Not all wars are about territory. Some could be about, shipping lanes or interdiction of rockets and all the rest of it. This one's about territory. And if you've got a war about territory, then the key element in that war are your men at arms, your infanteers, your tank soldiers, your artillerymen. And Ukraine's got a lot of problems here. It's original 2022, it had a regular army that's been heavily degraded by the casualties now. And basically, our listeners, it's very difficult to understand exactly what's going on in the East. It's carnage. Huge casualty levels out in the East. Its original army is depleted. Then it had the volunteer wave of guys volunteering to fight the Russians. They were incorporated in the army. That volunteer wave is heavily degraded. So now you've got the mobilized element, and that's all well and good, but the average age of the mobilized element is 43 years old, because Ukraine is not mobilizing men under the age of 27. Now, what you need really with mobilized forces, if you're going to attack and take territory, you need guys in their 20s. So it's got to address this problem. There is a mobilization bill being debated by cabinet at the moment in Ukraine. But on the other hand, there's a lot of doubt in Ukrainian society over the issue of giving its young men to this war. They're not very well trained before they're sent off to the front. Huge casualties amongst Ukrainian forces. So the issue of mobilization and lowering the age of mobilized men is one that Ukraine really has to address in parallel with the external problems due to funding and weaponizing by its Western allies, its Western partners. But this war ultimately will be won or lost not by sea drones, not by FPVs, suicide drones, or even by hypersonic missiles. This war will be run and lost by who has the most efficient infantry forces in the field.
Well, we'll speak about that mobilisation bill in a moment because we're going to cross to the Ukrainian parliament. But in terms of the state of the Russian forces, you talked there about the kind of Ukrainian mobilisation. We had heard a lot about the way in which people were being almost dragooned into the Russian army, and also hearing about how old some of their kit was. But again, is that propaganda that we're getting in the West, or you know, what is the state of Russian forces and stuff that goes bang?
So I think there has been a lot of self-deception amongst some of the coverage of the war in the West, but that there are two things which are true here. For example, if we look at over the past year, Ukraine had a series of key defeats. One was in Bakhmut, lost Bakhmut. One was the defeat of the counteroffensive in the summer, which was defeated. It didn't run out of steam, it was defeated. And most recently, the loss of Avdiivka. So there are different answers to why Russia won those respective battles. But certainly when it came to Bakhmut, yes, the Russians won Bakhmut with an expendable convict army. That was a Wagner Group convict army. Preceding that, Russia had mobilized about 300,000 men in late 2022. That was a very unpopular measure. But since then, Russia has recruited over 300,000 volunteers. Now, those aren't mobilized men. These aren't men dragooned into conflict. These are guys who are, for pay, joining the army, and they are fighting very, very hard, as we've seen in Avdiivka. In Avdiivka, there were some convict units involved. There are a lot of regular units involved. And for the right pay, Russians will march, Russians will fight. So the nature of the Russian army has changed. The Russians also have been extremely effective in fortifying ground, far more effective than the Ukrainians in fortifying ground that they hold. They secure multiple layer defense lines with huge minefields, very difficult to breach. But also the Russian defense budget for 2024 is absolutely huge now. It's equivalent to about 86 billion pounds. Their military industrial complex has been revitalized, and it can fix and make destroyed tanks far quicker than Western partners and Western allies can supply war machinery to the West. So there is a big disparity there, and Russia has really regenerated over the last year and a half, not only its forces, but its machinery.
Oh, well, Luke, thank you so much for that, Anthony. Let's cross now to the Ukrainian parliament. We can speak to Kira Rudik, who's the leader of the Holos party. Kira, it's very good to speak to you again. I know we spoke just before Christmas. Anthony Lloyd there talked about this mobilisation bill that's going through the parliament. Can you tell me a bit about it?
Hello, Ruth. Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be back on the show. First of all, it is important to understand that mobilization started 2 years ago on February 22nd and 21st, and it did not stop. What we are discussing right now in the parliament is better, more just rules that would at some point allow people who are fighting at the front to have some rotation. Because right now, for people who were mobilized or who went there deliberately, it is like just one-way street, and there is no good way for them to come back to their families, even after fighting for 2 years. And some of them have been fighting longer, because the war did not start 2 years ago. It started 10 years ago when Russia first occupied Crimea and our eastern territories. So we are trying to figure out what would be the best way of creating a set of rules to make sure that we mobilize people and they understand who will be mobilized, when, and the most important, for how long. And of course, to motivate people to go to the front, there are many ways, but one of the main threats and main counter arguments that they have is this fear of fighting the enemy empty-handed. And this is why the news about the delays with the ammunition and with the weapons, with the support package stuck in the US Congress, it honestly does not really help at all. And not only on the factual side, but also on the motivational side.
And in terms of the actions and how the conflict itself has changed in the last sort of 12 months, we've seen a real increase in the kind of shelling of civilian areas. And in fact, we saw even your house had its windows blown in. You were there. It really is hitting suburban areas too.
Indeed, Rusit was one of the most terrifying experiences that I had in my life. And I don't think that you can emotionally recover from it. It was really Armageddon experience when I have been inside the house when it happened, and when I have seen the windows being pulled out of their frames because of the explosion and thrown into the middle of the room. There were glass shatters in my body, and I was really lucky that I did not get hurt worse, because many of my neighbors were really severely wounded. And at that moment, by just one missile hit, there were 5 people killed, but also a 9-story building of 6 entrances was almost burned to the ground. And this is so, you feel so hopeless and so helpless when something like this happens, because as a human being, as a citizen, there is nothing that you can do against the missile, right? You can train to fight, you can have a fire extinguisher at home, but there is nothing you can do against this huge pile of metal going from the sky to kill you and everything that you loved. And this is what's happening actually every single night. Civilian cities.
And if you, Kira, sorry to interrupt, but if you are feeling as if you are powerless and you are helpless, and you not just lead a political party within the parliament, and help make decisions, but you're also a deputy of the parliament, presumably there is a lot of the population who have had another second very difficult winter that have been subject to this, who's we talk about morale, but it's more than that, who must be struggling so much with just how vulnerable they feel.
It is true. It is absolutely true. And this is the terror that we are living under for 2 years already, and some of our regions for 10 years. But there was something else, Ruth, and I think it's necessary to talk about that. That when it happened, there was no discussions or bickering or talking about how people are exhausted. People were working all together, helping each other, supporting each other, doing everything possible and impossible just for a very simple mean to survive. So more of us will survive through this terrorist attack. And I have seen so much love and so much resilience from people who honestly should not have any, because they have been through so many dramatic events of their life. But we still have it in us. And I'm absolutely sure of that, because I witnessed that.
Kira, we wish you all the strength for you and your countrymen as you go forward. Thank you again for joining us on the programme. I was Kira Rudik there, leader of the Holos Party in the Ukrainian